So 3 years on, and to be honest, I think that the meadow looks pretty crap. I don't think it's doing what I had intended for it, and it's in such a prominent position in the garden. I sort of want a little bit more aesthetically from it because it's the centerpiece. I've had common poppies, so Papava roeas, had some tiny little patches of bird's foot trefoil last year, oxeye daisies, common knapweed, common vet, lady's bedstraw, meadow cranesbill. I've had quite a lot of different things that have been in there. Some self-heal that's been in there, obviously lots of clover. Most of it is just dominant, very competitive grasses. And because it's the main part of my garden, and I'm not lucky enough to have an absolutely enormous garden, I want a little bit more from it. And I don't think that at the scale that it's at, it achieves that meadow feel, which I believe that is something that is greater than the sum of its parts. But I think it's dependent on scale. If you've got a little patch like this, it just looks like a sorry tuft of pubes when it goes over and flops. And that's something that happens every year. It gets to a certain stage in the summer, it rains a lot, it gets really tall, and then flops. And I think that that is also a symptom of the fact that the conditions in my garden were never correct to begin with for making a meadow. Failing to create the meadow that you desire is something that I'm not alone with. And in fact, I've had a lot of messages from people saying that they've had exactly the same issues. And when I've been called out to other gardens, every single person who I've seen attempt it has had exactly the same problem as me. Part of that is because our view of meadows, I think, is largely romantic. We have an imagination of what they should be, and then we want to put them into our gardens, which means that our idea of them is non-specific. We're not actually defining what we want to get out of it, so it's very difficult to achieve that objective. And I was absolutely as guilty as anybody else in falling for this romantic notion when I started to try and make my own. We're often persuaded by alarming statistics, such as 97% of our wildflower meadows have been lost since the 1930s, or things like gardens make up more total area than national parks in the UK when you combine them. And then with those two bits of information, we falsely believe that the best thing to do would be to turn all of our gardens into the meadows to replace that lost habitat. But it would be unlikely to have the desired effect because gardens don't represent land that can easily be converted into that lost habitat, because the hay meadows that we're trying to replace took hundreds, if not thousands of years of low intensity farming in order to get them into the state that they were in. But where does that leave us, and what can we do? I think it would start by attempting to understand the value that gardens have for wildlife anyway, and not discounting the reasons for that, and trying to delve into that a little bit deeper before we start trying to say that we need to have our gardens replace habitat that they're not necessarily best catered to doing, and also defining what we mean by a meadow. Do the species of plant that you select matter? Do they have to be native? And does it have to be pretty? Is it just simply vain to expect it to be pretty? Or do we need to change our aesthetic preferences to meet what we think is ecologically better? But if it is the case that it's ecologically better, what evidence is there in a garden setting that it's ecologically better? Because if you can get something that looks better and it's ecologically equal, why would you bother doing something that looks worse? Obviously, looks is completely subjective, and if the look of my floppy meadow is something that you like, then I've documented all of it so you can follow the steps to create what I have. But in other words, is prettiness at the expense of biodiversity? In some previous videos, I went through the available research that's been carried out on UK gardens, and it appears that gardens are good for wildlife, even if the person who's gardening isn't specifically gardening with wildlife in mind. On a species per area basis, there's more in gardens than there is in any of the semi-wild habitats that are in protected areas. You're not seeing people call for protected areas to be turned into gardens. Obviously that wouldn't be a good idea anyway, but you can understand why the logic is then flawed for making your gardens try to appear like those semi-wild areas, because it wouldn't necessarily be a benefit, and in most cases not even possible anyway. In those experiments, the long-held view that you need to have lots of native wildflowers in your garden in order for it to be good for wildlife was challenged. The gardens that had a higher proportion of native wildflowers didn't show any greater diversity or abundance of species that were found there. So when people say native wildflowers are essential to having a garden that's rich in wildlife, they're doing it mainly because they want native wildflowers to give you a better garden, not because it's based on any evidence that they've necessarily collected. And clearly, native wildflowers are really important in spaces where they're managed in a low intensity way. So roadside verges, parts of farmland, and other semi-wild places in the UK, because without them there would be a lot less in the way of nectar and larval food sources and all the other benefits that plants that don't need very much looking after have to us. And I don't think that that should be disappointing, because realistically what that means is in your own garden you can come up with a meadow of your own design, and you don't have to worry too much about what plants you're using insofar as whether they're good or bad for wildlife, because ultimately a plant is almost always better for wildlife than no plants. But given that the last attempt at making a meadow in my own garden disappointed me for the best part of 3 years, what can I do on the next iteration to avoid that? The preparation that I used was to remove most of the grass coverage by scarification. Well, I went a little bit further than that and just scraped the top off, but most of the roots were still left intact, and I don't know whether that was enough. In fact, I know it wasn't enough, because you can see that there's absolutely loads of grasses in there. We're often told in the UK to use hemiparasites like euphrasia, yellow rattle, red bartzia, and they attach to the roots of grasses and they rely on those grasses for their own growth, thereby taking some of the resources from those grasses and weakening them. And this is supposed to reduce the dominance of the competitive grasses that we have in such abundance. You can actually see how much weaker the grass growth is here as opposed to here where the yellow rattle isn't. You see that patch of it there. But I think that this is actually flawed advice in lots of cases, because the grass cover is often so thick that you never even get the germination of those hemiparasites. It's maybe naive to assume that that's enough to be able to solve the problem of those competitive grasses. There's something pervasive among people who garden with conservation or wildlife in mind, which is that saying that something is aesthetically pleasing or pretty in a traditional sense is purely vain, and that it's up to us to change our aesthetic preferences to what is given as an example of something that is supposed to be better for wildlife. And it might be good for wildlife in wild spaces, but the evidence so far suggests that it's not necessarily better for wildlife in your garden. So you don't have to make your garden look like a nature reserve. You can have it look like a normal garden and it's still just as good for wildlife. So the idea that vanity is something that hinders your ability to cater for wildlife is probably untrue. And I think that it fundamentally undervalues what our gardens can provide and expects them to provide more than they possibly can. And what I think is important to say is one of the most valuable things that our gardens can do for wildlife is that they give us a space where we can engage with nature, and it's a pretty useful thing for getting people's minds into the idea of conservation and how we need to adapt things for our changing climate. But I don't think we should forget that our gardens are doing something for wildlife anyway. So as I've said in previous videos, you don't have to make fake countryside in order to have a garden that's friendly for wildlife. And so I would take this advice into the creation of a meadow, which is that you can have the plants that thrive in the conditions in your garden. They can be pretty and it can be good for wildlife. And how you do that is something that I'm going to be trying to document as I look through some sources of information that I'll reveal later in the video. And if you are trying to create fake bits of countryside, what people are reluctant to admit is that you're only ever interpreting what you think has been somewhere before. So if you think that you're creating a hay meadow, you're creating an interpretation of a hay meadow, and not all hay meadows were the same. And it's unlikely that you're going to create a many hundreds of years old ecosystem in conditions that are not favourable for its creation. So with that in mind, why not design the meadow consciously and thinking about how you want it to look and making that the primary focus, and have it as something that's ornamental and beautiful by any standards. This is precisely what's suggested by James Hitchmo in Sowing Beauty, which is the book where he's tried to condense pretty much a lifetime of work of going around the world and looking at the different types of species-rich grassland, selecting plants and putting them into environments in which they'll thrive, so that you don't have to do quite as much work as you do for maintaining, say, a traditional herbaceous border, but it doesn't attempt to mimic any specific type of grassland found anywhere else. You can just have it designed based on your aesthetic preferences, and you know that it will also be really beneficial to pollinators and insects that are going to be coming into your garden, and all other types of wildlife that's coming there too. Because he suggests using plants that are well adapted to the conditions that your garden already has on the basis of its fertility, and if you're in the UK, that the plants that are used aren't too palatable to slugs because they'll just eat the lot, and also choosing plants based on their ecological classifications rather than their horticultural ones. And I'll get more into that in some later videos. But by doing that, it's much more likely that you'll have success in the creation of your meadow. I'm planning to redo the meadow in my garden using the principles, and I'll document all of it and upload it to here, and I'll try to include as many of the mistakes as I do the successes, because I don't like to give these false impressions that I know everything about this stuff, because that's just not the case, and it's not helpful to anybody else who's trying to attempt something similar, because so much of the garden media make out that things are really straightforward and easy, and it makes you feel like a moron when you're not able to do it. But only reading books can only get you so far, and that's why I've also spoken to my good friend Andy from Torres Land Care in British Columbia, because I saw that he had posted to offer to get rid of people's lawns in North America and to replace them with meadows. And given that he's done this in a number of projects in botanical gardens and for private clients, I thought I would pick his brains, and we've recorded the conversation that we've had so that you can see in context. And if you want to, you could also ring him up for a consultation, because these things are quite complicated, so it's probably easier to have someone give you an individual plan than think that you can take what I've done and adapt it to wherever you are. So I'll reveal that conversation next time. And thank you so much to everybody who's been on this journey so far with me. I've seen that the series that I've created for it has been the best viewed one that I've had, so I'm glad that it resonates with so many people. Let's allow it to continue and see where it goes, and I'm really looking forward to helping more people to be inspired to be able to do it and to have greater success at doing it, and learning from my mistakes rather than having to have the heartache yourself. Or if you have had that heartache, then at least you feel a little bit better that you weren't alone. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again next week, where I will reveal the conversation that I had with Andy.